Right, we're almost at start time. We'll give everyone a few more minutes to join, and then we'll kick off. We'll give everyone another minute, and then we'll kick off. All right, I'm going to go and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to my session on elevating your documentation with PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. My name is Darren Robinson, and I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I'm a Principal Identity and Access Management Architect with Telstra Purple. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Enterprise Mobility, Identity and Access Management. In this session, we'll start off with a short introduction to what Jupyter Notebook is. We will dive into my quick start guide to getting started with Jupyter Notebook, the different ways you can go about using Jupyter Notebook with PowerShell, and then some advanced examples on using PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. When I first saw Jupyter Notebook, it took me a little bit to get my head around what it actually was and what it could be useful for me. At that time, however, Jupyter Notebook was primarily being used with Python and for data science and analysis use cases. PowerShell wasn't supported at that time. This was a couple of years ago. If you haven't seen Jupyter Notebook before, the best comparison I can give you would be if you consider a PowerShell ISE environment munched together with OneNote. You have an environment where you can transcribe your notes and documentation, but you can add code snippets, execute them, and capture their output. And then you can share those notebooks, but with live code. And that's what Jupyter Notebooks are extensively used for, often used for data science and analysis to show how to obtain data, how to cleanse the data, how to transform it before performing simulations and modeling on it. So if you haven't heard of PowerShell Jupyter Notebook, it's probably because it's relatively new. In fact, it's currently in an early preview release, which was announced in February this year. PowerShell support with Jupyter Notebook is using PowerShell 7, which is the latest release of PowerShell, which was previously called PowerShell Core. It also leverages .NET Interactive. .NET Interactive was formerly known as Try.NET. This rename happened around the same time as this early preview release. What .NET Interactive gives us is the ability to embed .NET with interactive solutions such as CodeBots, embedded script engines, and what we're talking about today, Jupyter Notebooks. So with .NET Interactive, we get 3 kernel environments that we can use with Jupyter Notebooks: C#, F#, and PowerShell. It's the latter, PowerShell, that we're going to be covering today. So some scenarios about what you would use a Jupyter Notebook for. I've already touched on where Jupyter Notebooks have come from and how they're used extensively with data science. However, us as IT professionals, and now with PowerShell support in Jupyter Notebook, we can start to leverage it for our scenarios, more akin to interactive documentation, showing processes and interactive guides that we'd use in an IT pro world. So let's have a first look at what a PowerShell Jupyter Notebook looks like. I'm going to flick over here to a command window. I'm going to start a Jupyter Notebook environment, which is starting up a Jupyter environment. It's in a little batch file, which is starting a process. It gives us the process then running. We can then take the URL and put it into a browser, which I will bring up here, and we can access a local PowerShell environment. One too many dashes in there. Get rid of all of those. And there we go. So this is what you see when you enter a new PowerShell Jupyter environment. You see a place where it shows you the local files from the directory in which you have run it from, and these are the files that are in the workspace from where I launched Jupyter Notebook from. The files with a .ipynb extension are Jupyter Notebooks. So this environment, if we were to start a new Jupyter Notebook, you can see we've got the options of C#, F#, or PowerShell. So let's do a PowerShell one. And this starts up a brand new notebook. We see the kernel is starting, and then it's ready. It tells us we're in a .NET PowerShell environment, and we have a cell here. This cell is a code cell. There's two types of cells. There's Markdown cells and code cells. By default, we're straight into a code cell, and I know it's a code cell because it tells me it's a code cell here, and it also says it's in here. So if I can now type any PowerShell command. Let's do ps version table, and then press Shift Enter to execute that cell. That'll execute that PowerShell command and give us the output from it. So from this, I can see we're in a PowerShell 7 environment, actually running 7.02, which is the latest release of PowerShell. So in this notebook, we've now got one cell, we've executed, and we're in here. But now in the next cell, we could put another PowerShell command in there. Or we could click just outside that cell, and then we can then issue some keyboard shortcuts to add or remove things from our notebook. Now, a shortcut that it takes a little bit to get familiarize yourself with a lot of the shortcuts, but if we do a Control-Shift-P, we see all the shortcuts that are available to us in this environment. Now, pretty quickly, you're going to memorize some of these because there's some that you use a lot. And I'll show you a few of the common ones that you'll be using when you get started in a Jupyter environment. So when you're outside of a cell like I am here, if I press the A key, it will insert a new cell above the current cell. If I press B, it will insert a new cell below the current cell that I'm currently in. So these are still code cells because that's the default. If I press M, then that will change this cell to be a markup cell. You see the cell type here also changed to Markdown. You can also change from cell type from this menu here, but it's a lot quicker to do that with the keyboard shortcuts that you'll be doing. So in a Markdown, this is where I can type my documentation. This is a Markdown cell. And then I can put some formatting around that. So if I do hash and I do Markdown and I do Shift Enter, that will execute that cell and format it as Markdown. So you can see the hash made it a title or a heading, whereas the other text is just text. Other common shortcuts that you use a lot is DD. If I do DD, it deletes a cell when you're outside of that cell. So if you're inside and you're pressing into the keys like A or B or DD, then they just go straight into the cell. If you're just outside the cell, by clicking outside it, then you get the shortcuts. A to insert a new cell above where you are, B to insert a new one below, M to change it to Markdown. If you're in Markdown and you want to a Markdown cell and you want to change it to code, you press Y. So that's a quick first look at what a PowerShell Jupyter Notebook looks like. The keyboard shortcuts I ran through there. Control-Shift-P shows you a list of the shortcuts. Shift-Enter to run a cell. Outside of a cell, use A to insert above, B below, M to change to Markdown, Y to change it to code, and DD to delete. Now, all of those are available from the menu systems, but familiarizing yourself with these keyboard shortcuts will get you up and running pretty quickly. If we jump back to this slide here, and we're in a code cell here. If I delete this one here, delete that one there, then in here we can look at some of the environment that we get by default in our PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. So if I use the PowerShell command, get command, and then the module that comes with PowerShell Jupyter Notebook, press enter, we've actually got 3 commandlets which are part of that module. That gives us the ability to do some charts and out displays. These are 2 things which are often used in Jupyter environments, which aren't covered as part of the general PowerShell module that you would normally see. If we want to see some information about our environment, about our notebook environment, we can enter the about command, and we can see that we are in a .NET Interactive environment, and the version that we're running is a recent build from the 10th of July. One other command that is quite useful just to see what's available in the different shells. Excuse me. We've got the .NET kernel, we've got C# kernel, F# kernel, and the PowerShell kernel. So these are some special commands which are in development as part of this preview release. Okay. And there's an overview of what we've just seen there. So let's talk a little bit more about Markdown. Hopefully you're all very familiar with PowerShell, or you use PowerShell to some extent in your general work activities, but you may not be familiar with what Markdown is. Markdown is a markup language for formatting text. A Markdown application takes a Markdown file and converts it to render in HTML with a browser. You might be familiar with Markdown if you use GitHub a lot. The READMEs in GitHub are in Markdown format. So we have some syntax that we use with Markdown that allows us to format the text in different ways. So you saw me before put a single hash in front of some text, which then turned it into a bold heading. So a single hash is a heading 1, a double hash is a heading 2, and so on and so forth. You can go down and then the headings get slightly smaller in terms of font and weight. In order to bold some text, we put asterisks around it, and then that will give us bold. Underscores will give us italics, tildes will give us strike through. So that's some common things you use for formatting text, for emphasizing text or providing structure to a document with headings. Another common thing that we use in Markdown is providing a link, a hyperlink to a web address. So by putting in square brackets the text that we want within the document, but then if you were to click on that link, where does that link take you to? So square brackets are the text you see, and the curved brackets contain the web address where that will end up. To display an image in Markdown, we have the alternate text for the image in the square brackets, and then the source of the image that will be displayed, and it's all prepended with a bang. And I'll show some examples of this. If you want to show a little bit of code as sort of one line, you put a backtick in front of it and a backtick behind it. That tells Markdown that there's some code in that text. And what that will do is it will give you a fixed format font and give you a nice looking rendering of that code snippet. If you've got a code block, you enter with 3 backticks your code, and then 3 backticks again, and that blocks that whole region as a code block. And lists, the other common one, just prepend it with a dash in front of it, and that will give us a list. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So here's a lorem ipsum document as Markdown. You can see in the view for defining the look and feel of this series of text, we've got a reference to a web address. We've got a heading 1 and a heading 2. Then we've just got some text here. You can see we've got some asterisks around a bit of text, which indicates that it's going to be bold. This one wasn't in my cheat sheet before, but these 3 indents with the greater than sign will render this as a quote. We have a code block here with our 3 backticks surrounding the code. That will display as a nice fixed width font when it's rendered. We've also then got a list. So let's see what that looks like when that is rendered and executed on that cell as Markdown, and it's turned into HTML and what we see. And this is that rendered example. So here you see, we see the reference, we don't see the link, but if we were to click on that reference, then we would be taken to that web address. We see our heading, we see our second level heading. We also see that sort of quote text that we saw in the Markdown. We see our code block. We can see the font is a little bit different and formats it nicely as a fixed width font. And we also see our list. We see some bold text. We see some other links in that as well. All right, let's have a look at some PowerShell Notebook examples. Flip back to my demo environment here. I'm going to go back to my workspace here, and I'm going to open this PowerShell Notebook here, which has some examples of what you can do and how you can display certain things using PowerShell in a nice graphical and interactive manner. Some of these examples may help you with thinking about how you're going to use it for a documentation or process purposes. So in this first example, I'm using a PowerShell command, invoke web request, to go to a web address and get an image, and then I'm piping it out to a file, and that file is dilbert.gif. So if we have a look at executing this here, I do Shift Enter on here, it executes this command, and if we go and have a look at our directory, we can see that I have a dilbert.gif file that was updated seconds ago because it went and executed that. In the edit view here, you can see I've got a second level heading and then a third level heading, but then I've got the Markdown to display an image. And the image is dilbert.gif from the local file system with an alt text of dilbert. So if I execute this, you can see it's displaying the image that we recently outputted from the previous command with the hover over text of dilbert. So that shows us combining a PowerShell command to get something graphical and then display it as part of a PowerShell notebook. So there's something a little bit more complex. In this example, I'm using PowerShell again to get an image from a web address. In this case, it's coming from this URL here. It's a JPEG image file, and then I'm selecting the content of it. So I'm using invoke web request to get this image. I'm then converting that binary data that's coming back of that image. I'm converting it using the system.convert.net call to a base64 string. So it's taken the image output from getting this JPEG, it's converting it to a base64 string, and then I'm encapsulating that base64 image string with a HTML image tag, telling it it's an image of a JPEG type, it's in base64 format, and then I'm taking the base64 string here, and this is what we get. So if I execute this again here, it executed that command. Here's the base64 string of that image encapsulated with the HTML image tag. So in a PowerShell Jupyter Notebook, we can tell it to actually do a little bit of HTML, even though we're in a PowerShell kernel. So by putting the hash bang HTML keyword here, we can switch this code cell over to be HTML. I'm then using center and then using the image source and the rendering from above to render the image in line of this PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. So if you learn PowerShell, you will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Okay, let's move on from images to icons and fonts. So if you've ever done any little bit of web development, or even if you've used web apps, you'll notice there's usually icons for things like file and save and folders and other sort of common things that we have icons for. Usually those actually come from Font Awesome. So what Font Awesome is it's a collection of images that can be used in web applications and libraries. So with Font Awesome, we can search for an icon. We can search for, say, Microsoft. And you can see that in Font Awesome, there are two icons for Microsoft. We have the flat 4 square icon, and then we have the one with a bit more perspective on it. And it gives us the HTML codes to use that icon in an application. But we're going to use it as part of our PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. What we've also got is the ability to also maybe use emojis. So we can search for an emoji. Let's search for shell. Spiral shell. And here's an emoji for a spiral shell. We can see how that emoji renders on different platforms. We're on the Microsoft platform. This is what we're going to get for our shell. So if we go back to here, again, using HTML inside our PowerShell piece, we can call the JavaScript library that will allow us to render Font Awesome icons. We can put that in our head, and then in the body, we can use the tags from our Font Awesome icons that we want to use, and then we can also paste in our emoji here. So if I execute this snippet here, you can see that we've got Windows, PowerShell. So that's another option for adding some imagery into a Jupyter Notebook. In terms of another way of getting some color, something that's maybe a little bit eye-catching, is if we look at a Mandelbrot set. If you're not familiar with a Mandelbrot set, it's a mathematical equation where you iteratively run through an algorithm, and then you can generate some graphical images of it. So here's an example from a Fractal Bot Twitter handle of a Mandelbrot, but we can do something similar in PowerShell with the mathematical equation. And in order to output that into the console, we use the right host, but we use a background color with different colors to represent different parts of the output. So what we see here is a Mandelbrot that's outputted to the console using background colors in PowerShell into the console. Now, this isn't something you'd probably put in your documentation, but it shows that if you think about what you're outputting from your text, you can use background color and foreground colors as part of that output to actually provide some presentation, some imagery into your output in a PowerShell notebook, and that can help with your documentation. ASCII art, this is probably maybe a stretch too far, but everything that's old is new again. We can use PowerShell to call out to an API. In this case, there's an ASCII art API. We can call out to the API, get it to give it some text to render and tell it what font we want, and then it will return that result back to us, and we can display that. So you can see we've got invoke REST method. I'm calling out to the API. The text is PowerShell, and the font that I want is Demo1. So executing that returns PowerShell. So if I changed this to PWSH PowerShell, then that's what we get back. Maybe not something you'll use, but there are plenty of other APIs out there, maybe something else that you want to call out to and get something back that will be part of some documentation or a call that makes something interactive and interesting. The last one I want to show in this piece is combining PowerShell and some HTML, CSS to change the format of how something is displayed. So if you use PowerShell a reasonable amount, you might be used to getting processes, getting services, getting something else, which ends up with a list of returned objects. And often you want to display those as a table. But if you display it as a table, it's usually two-dimensional. It's the heading and then just rows of white text, and that's it. So what we can do is we can combine HTML and PowerShell together to make that output a little bit more interesting or a little bit more engaging. So what I have here is a simple style sheet. This is defining how I want the output table to look with the content that I've got using PowerShell. So this is what I want the background colors to be, what I want the header row to be, what I want the font to be, what size the font is, and how I want the alternate rows within the table to look. So I'm using so I've defined the style sheet here. I'm then using a get process command. I'm selecting the process name, the ID. I'm converting it to HTML, and then I'm specifying the format for that HTML encoding or transposition. And then I'm outputting the result to processes.html. So if I execute this, we then go and have a look at our file system. We'll see that we've just outputted a processes.html. Here we are here. So you can see seconds ago that updated. And then if I use the HTML tag again, and I can display that outputted processes.html file in an iframe in the Jupyter Notebook. So if I press Shift Enter on that, we can see we've got a nicer formatted output table from our PowerShell command, combining HTML and PowerShell together. Of course, if you wanted to change the color maybe from a different blue, or maybe you wanted red or something else, all you got to do is change the style sheet, change the size of the font, or even the font you want, and then you'll get a different output that's maybe part of your brand or style guides for your documentation. So another example of what we can do with PowerShell and Jupyter Notebooks, I'm going to open this notebook here. So this is an example that I wrote yesterday that is using PowerShell in a Jupyter Notebook to Microsoft Graph using an Azure Active Directory registered application which has the permissions of audit log read all. We're making some calls to Microsoft Graph to get the sign-ins out of Azure AD, the most recent sign-ins. So in this example, these examples are available as part of the presentation at the end, and they'll also be in a blog post that will go live shortly, so you can reuse these and modify them for your own purposes. What I've done with this is I've actually because in order to talk to Microsoft Graph, we've got to authenticate. We need a client ID, a client secret, and a tenant ID in order to do that, when used in conjunction with the Microsoft Authentication Library PowerShell module. So as part of this, I'm installing the mcell.ps PowerShell module. I'm importing the module. I'm getting the content of some files that contain my secrets so that I'm not showing them here. I'm getting an access token, and then I'm making a query to Microsoft Graph to get the most recent 1,000 sign-ins to this particular tenant. I'm then going to group the data that I get back. I'm looking to group it based on the days in which those sign-ins occurred, and I'm going to select that based on those days and a count of the sign-ins on those days. So if I execute this, again, Shift Enter, it's going to take a few seconds to execute, because one is it's installing the PowerShell module from the PowerShell gallery. It's then importing it. It's then connecting to Microsoft Graph and getting an authenticated session. And then it's querying to get those 1,000 most recent sign-ins. And then it's going to give me the output of this query based on those sign-ins. So you can see of the last 1,000 sign-ins, the days in which they occurred. So today being the 16th, there's been 50 sign-ins in this tenant today. Yesterday there were 255, the day before 483, etc. So what we can then do with this data is then say we want to graph that. We want to look to see what that looks like visually, rather than just having a table of what the output looks like. So we can use graphing or charting inside of our PowerShell notebooks using the new Plotly chart commandlet. So when we looked at the commands that we had available that were unique to this environment, this was one of them. So all you need to do is say, I want to define a new graph of the type bar. We're going to give it a name, and then we're going to say which of our data is going to be on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, I want the name. The name is the dates. And then on the y-axis, I want the count data. And then I want it represented. So if I execute on this, again, Shift Enter, we can see this is a representation of the data that we saw in the table above. So if we hover over this, it gives us the day and it gives us the count. So this is a bar graph. What if we want a scatter graph? Exactly the same data in, we're just going to present it in a different graph manner. We can present it, rather than a bar graph, we can do it as a scatter graph. So again, I'm going to do Shift Enter on this. And there's the result that's come through. So we've got a scatter graph showing the number of logins over the number of days based on the data that we've got from Microsoft Graph, from our PowerShell query. There are other graphing options as well. I've just shown two there. I've shown the scatter graph and I've shown the bar graph. So here's an example from Microsoft showing some other graphing types. So I've just opened this notebook. There's no output in any of it, but we've got all the commands from their shared example notebook. So I can do, rather than running each of these individually like I've been showing you so far, we can run the entire notebook. So if I go Cell and I do Run All from the menu, it's going to execute every one of these code snippets and give us the output. So here's an example again of another scatter graph similar to what I had, except there's two data sets that are represented in the same scatter graph. Here's an example of the scatter graph without the lines joining the dots. So essentially this is the same data represented in a different way on a similar graph. And again, there's examples of this and how this is achieved. Obviously for your environment, where you get your data from, however you get it with PowerShell, doesn't really matter. You can then represent it on a graph. So further in here, we've got some other examples of other graph types. And there are a number of them here. Most of these are generated just with random data sets, but you can see that there's a number of different graph options that are available. All right, jump back to the slides. So what I've shown you there is some scenarios on how you can get from a web request an image and display it as Markdown. We've seen how we can get an image and then keep it all in process. We can then convert that to string and show that as an HTML block within a notebook. how we can use font awesome and emojis. Obviously, emojis don't have to be done as part of an HTML document like this, but font awesome does. But we've got some flexibility there. How we can control the colors of our output as part of our right host statements using background color, likewise foreground color as well. So we can make the output from our commands look interesting. We can call out to web APIs that transform other text into different ways effectively and then show the output in our notebook. Likewise, we can combine PowerShell and HTML to make the output from our PowerShell commands look pretty rather than just a standard output that you would normally be used to in a console window. Saw the bar graph and the scatter graph based on Azure AD Silence. So what I want to show you next is an example of some documentation I recently did for a PowerShell module I wrote. So I wrote a PowerShell module a few months ago, and it's a rather big module. It's got a number of commandlets in it. It's got about 80 commandlets in it, and it's quite, there's a few things you need to do to set it up to work within an environment. So I wrote a PowerShell notebook as a how-to guide, getting started guide. We've got a series of contents in here for each of the sections in the Jupyter Notebook. This is coming off a guest here. If this was actually in a Jupyter Notebook, you can select on these links and then it will take you down within the notebook to that section. But effectively what this did is gives anyone that's using the PowerShell module a document that shows them how to set up, how to configure it, but then also how to use all the commandlets within the PowerShell module. So this is an example of a good use of Jupyter Notebooks for documentation as an IT professional. It doesn't have to obviously be a PowerShell module or something like that. It can be anything that you're documenting, how-to guides. Someone takes this document, this notebook, they put it in their environment, they configure the credentials for their environment, and then they can execute these commands against their environment and see output that's from their environment. The work in order to define those commands or get the syntax right or get the structure right or get the sequence right, that's all done as part of the notebook. You just need to execute it and maybe update it for how you want to apply it in that environment. So I found this has significantly reduced the number of queries that I've got on how do you do this with the module? How do I do this scenario? How do I create this? How do I do this? Because this guide shows a working example of how to do it, and then it's easy enough for someone to transpose that to the application they're doing and what they want to achieve. Okay. So you've seen some of what we can do with a PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. You've seen some of the ways that we could use those in different scenarios. But how do you actually get started with an environment that you can actually use Jupyter Notebooks with? Well, we've got 3 different scenarios with 5 different options. The 3 different scenarios we've got is a local environment where it's running in your local Windows machine. We got containerized using Docker, and then we've got a cloud environment using Binder. I'm going to briefly talk about each of these and show you where you can get the guides that I've previously done to show you how to get started with those. So the first one we're going to look at is a local Jupyter lab in a Windows environment that's local to you. So whilst we want to use Jupyter with PowerShell, we have some dependencies on Python because Jupyter primarily from 2010 has been used with Python environments. So in your local Windows environment, first up, you're going to need to install Python. I've used it in both Python 2.x as well as 3.x. Both of them work. There's not really any concern because we're not actually using using Python too heavily other than the environment and the dependencies there. You're going to need PowerShell 7. 7.02 is the latest. The .NET SDK version 3 and .NET Interactive. Then you install Jupyter Lab, register the kernels, and then you can start your notebook. All that should take you around about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on your internet connection and how quickly you can get those dependencies sorted. If you already have a Python environment, then as long as you've got pip installed, you can use pip to install JupyterLab pretty quickly. The Windows binaries for chances are you've already got PowerShell 7, so the other ones are minimal as well. There's a blog post on my blog on how to do this, and that's a really good guide to stepping through if you just want to be able to follow the bouncing ball and get it done and get up and running relatively quickly. Second option is to build a containerized environment where we can take a Jupyter Docker reference image using a community version of a Jupyter environment for a .NET, and then we can tailor it to enable us to have an environment which meets the prerequisites that allow us to then use PowerShell there. So again, what we do is we take a reference community image. I've been using the C# one. I've been updating it for PowerShell 7, .NET Core, .NET Interactive, creating a startup script for Jupyter Notebook, saving, committing the image, and we're up and running. So all that will take you, if you're doing it manually like this process here, will take you, again, probably around 20 minutes, depending on your internet connectivity. The base community image that this is based off is around 4 gig. 4.2 gig, I think, off the top of my head. So you're going to need a little bit of disk space in order to do that. Again, there's a different blog here that specifies how to do this. In fact, the next 3 or 4 options are all contained in a single blog where I show how I've done it and how you can do it too. Now, chances are I probably don't recommend doing it this way because there's no real need. But if you're interested in how to do it step by step manually and do it all yourself in order to learn the process, then maybe it's worthwhile. Because once you've built that image, I've actually pushed that image to Docker Hub. So you can pull this image, Darren J. Robinson /PWSH-Jupyter-Notebook, and then you can run it in your local environment and be up and running in basically the time it takes you to pull that image. That image is around 4.4 gigabytes. So you will need that space in your local environment and you will need to pull down that image. So if you've got a good internet connection, you can be up and running in 5 minutes. There is the command in order to run it, and the batch file that you saw me run at the beginning of the first demo when I started the environment, that is the command in which I was running. So what if you want to build your own environment from a Docker file? That's another valid way. Here is a Docker file that will create an image based off the manual steps that I've shown in the previous slides, and again, have you up and running pretty quick. Effectively, if you clone my GitHub repo with this Docker file in it and the startup script that I've got, you can then do a Docker build, Docker run, and then be up and running. Again, you will need 4.5 gig of disk space in order to do that, and the commands and the process is all shown in this the same blog post as the previous one. And then the final one, and just before I do that, I'm just going to flip back here and I'm going to start the environment up because it takes a couple of minutes to start up, is the Kloud version, which is Binder. So what Binder is it's a SaaS service, it's a free SaaS service that can spin up an environment based on a Docker file and provide you with a Jupyter environment in the cloud for free. So effectively what it does is it takes the repo where I've got the Docker file to build the environment as per those previous instructions, and then it will dynamically build the environment. So you can see here, I just kicked it off a moment ago. If I click show, it's showing that there's found a built image, and it's launching a server and it's launching it on the browser. So the benefit of this is it's not consuming 4.5 gigs of your local storage or your space. It's running all on the cloud. It's a really nice, simple way to get started and have a go with messing around with it without consuming too many local resources. However, as it's a free SaaS service, the timeout on it is quite aggressive. So if you're not actively using it, the session will time out and your session will orphan itself from the back end. You can still copy out any work that you've done on it, but then it's gone. So if you go for a long coffee break, when you come back, it will have finished and will have stopped. So you can see it started up. It's started up in the My Binder, and we've got this environment here. So from here we can start a new PowerShell environment, new PowerShell notebook. Sorry, it's all running in our browser. This is running off the same Docker file. So if we do a PS version table again, Control Enter. We're running the same environment as we were locally, but we're doing it all out of a SaaS service. Okay, so some key takeaways. Jupyter PowerShell notebooks, they are awesome for documentation, training guides, process guides, how-to guides. The dependencies are PowerShell Core / PowerShell 7. So PowerShell 7 is what we're using for that name now. PowerShell Core's name is deprecated. You do also have the .NET Interactive and the .NET SDKs at the moment. It is an early preview release. It is evolving relatively quickly and more functionality is coming. But you can see right now, even though it's an early preview, there's still a lot we can do with it. Control-Shift-P will give you a list of all the shortcuts that you can use in the Jupyter Notebook. Shift-Enter to run a cell. Outside of a cell, we can insert new cells above, below, change a cell type from Markdown to code, and delete a cell pretty quickly. Those key combinations get memorized pretty quickly because you use them a lot. So hopefully from the session you've learned what Jupyter Notebook is. You've learned how we can use it with PowerShell, and hopefully learn some different options for running it, how you can quickly get started with it, and how you can use it to improve your documentation or training guides. There's 3 posts here on my blog that show you how to do it in a local environment, how to do it in a containerized environment, and there's also this presentation. The links to the examples that I showed are also available there. So the real question is, what will you do to elevate your Docker? How will you use it? Hopefully I've given you some inspiration, some ideas on how you can do that. And I encourage you to get started with PowerShell Jupyter Notebook and start using it in your daily scenarios. And with that, I'm going to see if there's any questions. How we going, Nadia?
We're going good. We do have a couple of questions in here. Did you want me to read them out to you?
Sure.
All right, the first one is, do you find PowerShell Jupyter Notebooks are commonly used?
Not overly commonly used at the moment because it's still preview. So I see this will be a lot more commonly used as it gets further through the release cycle, and also Word and documentation around it expands. So a lot of what I've shown you today is me using it for a few months without a lot of Docker. So it's having to work a lot of these things out. So hopefully with sessions like this, more information, it'll become more common.
Cool. This one's, I think, more of a statement more than a question. They said, if this works as well as the Python one, this could be useful.
Absolutely.
We've got another one. Is there an ability to plot data points on graphs and display them in the notebook?
Yep, I think we showed that in one of the demos. I showed how to do some graphs. I showed pulling data from Microsoft Graph and then displaying it in 2 different graph types. So I showed the other graphing options. You pull the data in, you define which different graph method you want, and then, yeah, that's all there.
Cool. The next one is, since this has only been announced at the beginning of the year, how are you finding it? Would you say there are some changes that could enhance the experience?
I'm finding it pretty good. I must admit, though, my earliest try with it, what I tried to do didn't work, and I was a little bit off put. But I persisted a little bit, and then with some later versions of the the SDK and the .NET Interactive, it became a lot more usable. So for me, it's probably more around what I was saying before, the documentation. The more examples and guides and notebooks that are using PowerShell Jupyter that there are, the more useful it's going to be, because then you'll be able to take code snippets from other people's examples and then use those in your applications and how you want to do things. So yeah, it's early days, but I see lots of potential for this, and I think it's going to become quite common in the foreseeable future.
Awesome. And the last couple of questions are more asking about the GitHub link, if you could share it with them. Do you want to pop them in the Q&A chat?
Yeah, so if I just jump over here. So there was a couple of GitHub links, but if I click over here, there's the Getting Creative here. So if you just look at my most two recent gists here are the ones that we saw today.
Cool. I've just had another question come in as well. Do you think PowerShell is much more powerful than command prompt?
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to pop these in for everyone.
So I'm just pasting in.
Yep, I've got the links.
There's another one here. There we go. Click on this one here. If I refresh whilst we've been talking, we should have, yeah, here we go. So the latest entry on my blog is a walkthrough of what we've covered in this session, including the screenshot, the snippets, the actual links to the notebooks themselves, and right down the bottom, all the way down the bottom, is the actual presentation as well. So I'll paste that one into the chat.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, someone was asking about the presentation and whether they'll be able to get access to it. So that's awesome. Pop that in as well. I'll just quickly put out there and say, look, if you've got any last minute questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. And while you do that, I might just go through and do just give a bit of an update on what's going on at the reactor and a few of the events that we do have up and coming as well. So I'm just going to share my screen with everybody. Awesome. So if you'd like to hear about more of the events that the reactor have going on, you can visit us at our meetup page on meetup.com/Microsoft Reactor Sydney. You'll be able to find a lot of the workshops that we do with our colleagues in the US as well. So, you know, we've got 2-hour programming workshops. For example, we did Introduction to Machine Learning. So it's around the whole data science and machine learning topics. You can also see more information on our Twitter page for our global events. And all sessions are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Someone did ask a question about that. It does take a couple of days for it to be uploaded. And they are also posted in the Meetup event page as well. So you'll get a notification about that. If you do have any questions or want to reach out to the Reactor Sydney to find out a little bit more, feel free to reach out to us at reactorsid@microsoft.com. So just a quick one for everyone. Next week, we have a session backed by popular demand called Build Your Own Virtual Assistant in Teams Using Azure AI. So this one's pretty self-explanatory, and it's also a very hands-on session as well. So do make sure that you bring your laptop. We do have another session around the ethical challenge of using facial recognition systems. So this will be delivered by one of our Microsoft Cloud Solution Architect colleagues. So they're going to share what Microsoft has learned and provide actionable guidance towards addressing these challenges using real-world examples from the Windows Hello and Face API that Teams has in Microsoft. And then the last one we have is the Azure Data Explorer. So this session is going to be delivered by our cloud solution architects, from one in Sydney and one also dialing in from Germany. And you're going to learn about big data analytics using the Azure Data Explainer, and they'll do, Explorer, and do a brief intro of Azure Data Explorer with a bunch of demos as well. So if you're interested, you want to find out more information, just head to our meetup page. If you do have any feedback on tonight's session, you can fill out a survey link with the event code 7996. I'll also pop that into the Q&A chat. So let me just check. Oh, we do have one last question that's come through, Darren.
Okay.
It says, this is from Shane, since it takes a while to spin up, do you find this only useful as a documentation tool for problems that are difficult to explain?
So it only takes time to spin up in the on the binder itself. I don't use binder, to be honest, that much at all. I use a local Docker container, and it spins up in like seconds, and I use it a lot. So I've always got one running. When it's running locally in a Docker container, it doesn't time out like the binder one, and it's just always there. It's the equivalent of just always having like VS Code open or OneNote or ISE. So yeah.
Awesome. I don't think there's any more questions coming through. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Darren for all the information that he's provided. I hope this is helpful. I hope he has given you some thoughts and some ideas on how you can elevate your use of PowerShell Jupyter Notebook. So thank you, and we will see. Oh, there's some really great feedback coming in. Wait, there's one more question from Shane. He's following on to that. He says, so if you have them running locally, how do you share?
So you just go back to the desktop. So when I showed you the local files that were sitting there, you just share the IP-NYB file itself, and you can share that to anyone. It's just like a JSON document. So it's a small file that you can then share with anyone via any method. Email, just a message, DM. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Thanks, Darren. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Welcome. Thank you.